Our colleague Fallon Gallagher is outside of the Supreme Court. I'm going to bring you back in, Fallon. Tell us, as you're reading through and processing this, we just got the new campaign finance decision. What do you know?
Yeah, this is going to have major implications for this year's midterms. In a 6-3 Kavanaugh ruling, the court is overturning campaign finance coordination limits. Now, of course, these limits had been in place to limit how the political parties could work directly with candidates. And the NRSC and actually J.D. Vance, when they brought this suit back in 2022, had argued that those limits violated the First Amendment. It violated their opportunity to actually work together to create campaign ads. And now the Supreme Court is agreeing with them, finding that this does, in fact, violate the First Amendment, that right of free speech, and that these limits must be overturned. So what this means now is that this is going to allow much greater coordination between the actual political party groups, think the RNC, DNC, NRSCC, all of those major political party groups with their actual candidates. So this is going to limit the power of super PACs and actually transfer that power back to the political party groups. Now, this is going to, in a political way, this is going to have massive implications for the fall because the Republicans are so well known for their massive fundraising power, significantly more so than the Democrats. So transferring this power is going to give them a major boost for this year's midterm elections. Again, this is a 6-3 ruling along political party lines, and it's not entirely surprising. It was pretty clear that they had at least enough of the conservatives. Notably, Justice Gorsuch didn't really talk during these arguments, but the fact that this is another Kavanaugh opinion and it's another 6-3 along party lines. Antonia?
Lisa, give me your analysis here.
Well, one of the things I think is really striking here is that the government itself wasn't defending the constitutionality of the coordination limits. So let me just take a step back and remind people what's at stake here. This isn't about an absolute dollar amount. This is about when you make a contribution to a political party, is the party itself allowed to coordinate with a candidate and spending money on behalf of that candidate in advance of an election? And today the court says yes. So the rise of the super PACs, these independent groups that are supposed to be walled off from candidates while they are spending on their behalf, we can expect to see super PACs diminish in their importance and to see the two-party system again rise and become even more important in the wake of this decision. Super PACs have had so much of their power in part because of the Supreme Court's putting limits on coordination between political parties and individual candidates. With that wall now gone, expect to see much more in the way of direct coordination between the parties and their sort of individual House and Senate apparatuses and individual candidates in advance of November. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't say that from a fundraising perspective, the RNC and its subgroups have long had a fundraising advantage, not only in anticipation of midterm elections, but also in advance of presidential elections. I think what this does, though, is make there's a whole ecosystem in Washington right now around these independent groups that will recede in importance. If you are a person out there who thinks the Republican and the Democratic Party do not speak for me, they continue to choose candidates that aren't in the mainstream or just are sort of too separated for where I see myself in the middle, this is a decision that is going to upset you even further. And I want to harken back to something our colleague Chris Jansing says. She says when she goes out and she talks to voters, one of the things they say most inhibits them from engaging with the political process is the Citizens United decision that held that corporations basically have a First Amendment right to spend on our elections. This decision today, the NRSC decision, this is one that 10 years from now, people will talk about in the same way that they talk about Citizens United. And of course, the one final thing I want to say is Charles was talking about earlier that this is a court that sort of likes history unless the facts change in a way that's inconvenient for them. And indeed, what you're seeing here in the majority opinion is them saying in light of not only doctrinal changes, that means changes in the law, but factual changes since 2001 when they last ruled on this question of coordination, that the government itself sort of agreed with the plaintiffs, including J.D. Vance, as Fallon noted, that the last decision that was precedent here no longer retains vitality. Interesting how changed factual circumstances are important to this court when it's important and not important when it's not important. And of course, I'm thinking about the birthright citizenship argument in advance of getting that decision, because at that argument, one of the things that John Sauer, the Solicitor General, said was like, we could not have envisioned a world where 8 billion people were a flight away from citizenship in this country. And the Chief Justice responded to him in a line that got a lot of laughs at the time. It's a new world, but it's an old Constitution. Yes. Let's see to what extent the Chief Justice and his colleagues are willing to defend that old Constitution, despite changing facts when we get to birthright citizenship.
I want to bring in two more people into this conversation. Rick Hasen, professor of law and political science, and Teddy Schleifer with the New York Times. He covers campaign finance and how billionaires influence American politics. Teddy, I want to start with you because of what you cover and you know so well. I mean, at a time when Americans, poll after poll shows that they are exhausted with the amount of money being spent in campaigns, as Lisa was alluding to, there are many Americans who don't feel that they're completely properly represented by the two dominating parties. It seems like a massive split screen here as things sort of snowball structurally and politically in one direction, but the American public, the electorate, goes in another.
Yeah, look, I mean, I don't know if this is necessarily going to increase the total amount of money spent on politics. I mean, I think the distribution is now going to be much more in favor of parties than it was, yesterday. So, if there's any voters out there who are concerned that this is going to lead to a gusher of cash, as we saw after Citizens United in 2010, I wouldn't necessarily jump to that conclusion right out the gate. But yes, the split screen moment, is obvious here. I mean, the court in general is loosening the restrictions on campaign spending at a time when, populists in both parties want to see more restrictions. They want to see the power of donors go down.
Rick, the 2024 election was the most expensive in U.S. history. The Washington Post reports the 50 biggest donors have already put nearly $1.4 billion into the midterms already. So how does this change the role that wealthy donors are going to play in our elections? What do you think are some of the immediate impacts people will see before this November?
Well, one of the first immediate impacts will be on television stations, because now political parties are going to be able to get the lowest rates that candidates are going to be able to get. So they're going to take a political hit. I think we're going to see a relatively limited amount of money that the ultra wealthy were spending through super PACs now going to parties. You'll be able to give kind of something around $700,000 to parties in coordination with candidates. So there'll be much more money flowing through parties. Whatever's left over can still flow through super PACs. I agree with Teddy. This opinion doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be even more money in politics. It means that it's going to strengthen political parties as opposed to outside groups. And some people think that's actually an improvement because political parties have a kind of brand to defend, while super PACs can just pop up for a particular election and then disappear again. So it's not clear to me that this opinion really changes all that much, other than, as Justice Kagan says in her dissent, it provides a way to for wealthy donors to have another path to try to influence how much the politicians are going to listen to them, because the parties are so closely allied with their candidates.
So I want to note that we just got the birthright citizenship case decision. Lisa is once again speed reading in for us. And while you do that, Lisa, I'm quickly going to go back to Teddy for a moment here. Teddy, if you are a wealthy donor, how does your behavior change as a result of this decision?
Well, historically, the most bang for your buck has been to give directly to candidates. But there are contribution limits on that, right? So if you want to give $3,500 to support a Democrat or Republican or someone running for president, that's where your first $3,500 goes. Then after that, at least in this before today world, you might give money to a super PAC. You might say, I'm going to give the next $5 million I want to spend on behalf of Susan Collins directly to a super PAC, and that group can spend on her behalf. Now, you might argue that you should give that money to the National Republican Senatorial Committee or to the RNC, because that money could, as Rick was saying, trickle more easily to the candidate themselves rather than to the outside group. So going forward, I know obviously we're thinking about this primarily in terms of how it affects Republicans and Democrats in the midterms. But I think if you are a party loyalist out there who believes that, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are some of America's greatest institutions. This is a good day for you. And if you are somebody who likes the Citizens United world with super PACs, it's a bad day.
The Supreme Court has made several rulings that affect the coming midterms, including stopping efforts to hurt mail ballot counting. But there's also the actual voting. You can hear the music. We have another election night in America with primaries in Colorado, which could impact what happens in D.C. A handful of hardline House Republicans also bucking the Speaker over a key defense bill, precisely because of the related issue that they didn't get an election meddling proposal in that Trump wants. Meanwhile, Trump is blocking something the House has actually achieved, which is the housing bill. He says it's a big yawn.
I don't know. I think it's so unimportant by compared to the Save America Act. Compared to the Save America Act, just about everything is a big yawn.
Trump making a big point of the fact that this is a yawn, that he's bored by a bill that actually affects people's lives and housing and their access to affordable housing, among other issues, because he's just thinking about elections, which is, as usual, a politician thinking about themselves. And what he wants to do is meddle in the midterms. I'll remind you, the Republican Senate leader already said that bill that Trump referenced isn't going to make it out into law this year. Meanwhile, speaking of things that are more focused on himself than the good of the American public, Trump privately awarded a $500 million no-bid contract for the ballroom. The Post reporting on that. The White House claims it was all done according to rules. There's also new details on a construction at the White House South Lawn. Remember, we had that UFC bash. There's a new helipad for Trump, and the major defense contractor involved with it does government business, Lockheed Martin. They have, we should note, donated millions of dollars to help cover the cost. Now, how's this all faring out there? There's polling that shows Republicans are worried about Senate races in places that used to be completely safe. In deep red Texas, they have, according to the polls, a dead heat. Democrat James Tallarico is facing the scandal-plagued Republican candidate Ken Paxton. This was Trump's idea, to put in what was an unproven, more controversial figure in Paxton than the sitting Republican senator. If you need a reminder of why Republicans are mad at Trump for different reasons than Democrats, well, you're looking at one. They have to at least spend more money and time on Texas being a dead heat, let alone the possibility they could lose it. Republicans say Trump is basically acting out of touch, that there are many gaffes, and some of it is tailor-made for campaign attacks.
Mr. President, to what extent are Americans' financial situations motivating you to make a deal?
I don't think about Americans' financial situation. I don't think about anybody.
I don't care about the midterms.
Are you concerned, Mr. President, about the latest inflation number which came out this morning? Could that be a
No, I love it. The numbers were great. You know what I really love? I love the inflation. I don't want to drive housing prices down. I want to drive housing prices up.
Many have noted that President Trump is not the communicator he once was, and that is a nonpartisan issue. The former President, Joe Biden, also saw some diminution of some of his political skills, but writ large, I'm not sure Republicans would want everyone to even hear any communication coming from Trump, at least on those pocketbook economic and housing issues. We're back with New York Times columnist Michelle Goldberg, an MS Now political analyst, following these midterms, including a Texas tie that is pretty striking. Tallarico at 47. This is a pretty reputable poll in a pretty big state, New York Times, Siena, against Paxton, who appears to be doing worse than the person that he replaced because of Trump.
Right. And I think that was extremely predictable that Paxton would be doing worse. Look, Paxton was already running ahead even before Trump's endorsement, but Trump's endorsement possibly could have turned things around for John Cornyn. And I think that if those two are running even, Paxton, who is so scandal plagued, kind of so followed by such Rococo corruption, is kind of still, has financial scandals, sex scandals, was impeached by a Republican Texas House, And so if he's running even with Tallarico, you have to imagine that if John Cornyn was still in the race, who's been senator forever, he would be doing more comfortably. And, we've seen this before with Trump, right? It's kind of one of the reasons that we have 2 Democratic senators from Georgia, which used to be considered a solidly red state, is because Trump decided to go in all in behind Herschel Walker, another kind of totally unfit candidate. And so it obviously doesn't mean that James Tallarico is going to win Texas. But like you said, it means that they have to fight for it.
It's funny watching this. We were talking about where we are in the Supreme Court at the top of the hour and how much Trump has changed things. Here, though, on the politics, a lot of Republicans would prefer if Trump disappeared. He's so loud that that's seen as an impossibility. But in normal-ish eras, we've heard about, people want to keep distance from Obama or they don't want a Biden visit. That seems to be the mood of a lot of these Republicans, but they're in an information environment where you're not allowed to say that about your leader.
Well, I'm actually not sure if that's true. I mean, because they're in a bind. They've come to rely on a lot of these irregular voters that don't turn out when Donald Trump is on the ballot.
Universe, yep.
Right? And they've shed a bunch of their sort of like high propensity upper middle class suburbanites. Donald Trump has just announced that they're doing some sort of like midterm convention for the first time and they're going to do it in Texas, right? Presumably he thinks that is a way to pull this out, to put on a big show.
Yeah, tell us more about that, because we've heard of conventions, but you're pointing out that's actually unusual.
You don't have conventions, right? You usually have conventions every 4 years when you're either nominating president or running for re-election. They have not before had midterm conventions, and presumably, I would assume that part of the reason they're doing it in Texas is to hopefully juice excitement there. But I think it's also that kind of Trump is, you were talking earlier about how he is bored of, right? He thinks that the housing bill is a big yawn,
yeah.
Right? There was reporting that he found that he had gotten bored of the Iran war, right? He finds governing really boring. What he likes to do is decorate and put on shows. And so he's going to go to Texas and put on a show.
It's giving Caligula. Like that's late stage Trumpian lame duck.
Yeah, absolutely. The kind of tragedy is that for all of his machismo, he probably would have been happier as First Lady, where he could just devote himself to...
Michelle, I don't know that I've ever heard anyone say that. And it's interesting, putting aside the gendered history of all that, you're pointing out that if there were a role that were described as ceremonial, decorating, optics,
right, new ballrooms, that kind of, going over the kind of plans, talking about gilding, super gluing tchotchkes to the wall. That's kind of what gets him. That's what gets him excited.
We might have your next New York Times column on your hands, just brainstorming it right here. I think that's a really interesting point, and it also speaks to a fundamental superficiality. The promise of Trump, which he managed to revive for some voters in 24, was that he would turn those, whatever you call them, tactics and skills, the reality show, he would turn it towards governing. He would turn it towards negotiation. There are people, and I've interviewed them, I'm sure you have, who said, well, I want him to do The Apprentice, but with these other countries and get us better deals.
Right.
But you're pointing out that hasn't happened.
And I think that what probably no piece of propaganda has done more damage in, at least since World War II, than The Apprentice, right? Because the whole premise of The Apprentice is that Donald Trump was a great deal maker, and we are still living with the consequences of that fantasy, but it was always a fantasy.
It was a show. That's the thing about reality shows. Even people who like them, they know they're not real, mostly. But then they feel like eventually that is that person.
Right, but I think with Donald Trump, people really did think that he was this kind of titan of industry, that he was this extremely respected businessman.
Right.
And so, and that, I think that maybe... Yes, and that was an impression that was solidified with The Apprentice, and that has somehow never gone away, even though you can kind of see Donald Trump systematically do to the United States what he previously did to casinos in Atlantic City or Trump University. This is a person who kind of just, he constantly overreaches and either destroys things or leaves his own supporters or his own customers high and dry. And yet somehow the illusion doesn't go away. We've been waiting for it to go away for a decade.
Breaking a short time ago, new disclosures from the Office of Government Ethics, shining a new light on just how much Donald Trump is enriching himself while he's been in the White House. The president reported an astonishing $515 million from the sale of crypto tokens released by World Liberty Financial, along with another $65 million from equity in that company. Add on another $635 million from so-called celebration coins, also known as meme coins. And that, along with a few other income sources, amounts to over $1.4 billion on cryptocurrency and coin ventures. Ventures that he gets a direct say in regulating and influencing.
So, guys, if you take a walk by the White House, there's a lot of fencing up because there's a new ballroom that's under construction. Our president said this about the ballroom that's under construction. I'd like to play the tape.
There's a magnificent walkway that goes into what will be the most beautiful ballroom anywhere in the world. So we did this no charge to the taxpayer whatsoever. We're going to have the finest ballroom, I believe, anywhere in the world. We didn't ask for any tax money. We have no tax. This is taxpayer-free. We have no taxpayer putting up 10 cents.
There will never be another thing like this, I don't believe, built from a court standpoint. This is all my money and donors' money. This is tax-free.
And Trump did say no taxpayer money would be spent on the ballroom, but contractors' invoices show otherwise. From the Washington Post, a detailed project summary prepared for the White House by the contractor more than 3 weeks before Trump's comments estimated the total construction cost at $600 million, with more than half coming from taxpayers, according to a copy of the contractor estimate obtained by the Washington Post. Mr. President, we know that you have over $1.4 billion. Clearly, you can make up the difference, and taxpayers do not have to be on the hook for your ballroom.
That's what I got. I didn't see that one coming. That was a good turn, baby. I appreciate that. Yes, write that check.
Wondering where this was going.
Yeah, write that check, Mr. President. Look, the idea that you go out there, we talked a little bit earlier about the $600 million no-bid contract, the $16 million no-bid contracts, the no-bid contracts, and all this other stuff. You know, oh, the American people aren't paying for this. There's a little thing called ethics. There's a little thing called the perception of corruption. There's a little thing called influence peddling. I remember as Lieutenant Governor, I tried to get some supporters of our administration to contribute not new, but used computers to a high school that was in desperate need of the school of it. And I was told emphatically I could not get those donors to do that because of the appearance of impropriety, unethical influence in that regard. And I respected that. And so I went out and made the case in the budget to put the money in for such use. If this is so important, put the money in the budget and have the Congress vote up or down on it. Put it in front of the American people. But all of this is just BS for Donald Trump to grift, and grift, because that's all you know how to do. You can't run the country, but you can run it into the ground. And that's exactly what this is. And it's so unfortunate that we sit back and allow this man to sit in that White House and his kids and his family to take from the American people every damn day. How the hell do you make $1.4 billion in a year? Come on.
Well, and I don't think anything illustrates what you just described better than the $635 million that he made from royalties related to these meme coins. And for our viewers who don't understand what a meme coin is, I think it's worth explaining that because it tells that story crystal clear. It's a type of cryptocurrency that's actually built around a joke or a trend or a famous face rather than a real product or company. So this is something that Trump launched ahead of the inauguration on his name recognition alone. And at the end of the day, the buyers of the meme coin, regular citizens, voters, people who might have voted for Trump, mostly lost money, and that was because the insiders held on to their coin and made money.
Right.
It's just staggering. I mean, in every single level, it is. And we should also say real quickly that the ballroom's a no-bid contract, and they said it was routed through the executive residence, and that way it can be exempt from usual solicitation and competitive bids. And it's just every single loophole they have to enrich themselves, they take.
Joining us, MS Now senior legal reporter Lisa Rubin, law professor at Vanderbilt University and former clerk for Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia, Brian Fitzpatrick, and executive editor at The Nation, John Nichols. I think what the president has done here, just to take a moment from analyzing the decision, which we've been doing all day really well, I think what he's doing here, going and asking for help from Congress on trying to amend the Constitution, I mean, if he wants it done, that is the way to do it. That's how it's supposed to work, right? Right, Brian?
Yes, if we don't like what the Constitution says, we're supposed to change it, not ask for the Supreme Court to change it for us. That's the right process.
John, this idea of opening up the Constitution, amending it to better suit this day and this age, it's something that a lot of folks want. I know that this is not the lead of this news today. The lead is that the president was rejected by the Supreme Court, and we're going to get to all that. But I am struck by just the opportunity to have a discussion about changing the Constitution to better reflect this country as it is today. And I'm not talking about on birthright. I'm talking about a broad array of policies and rights that a lot of Americans feel should be enshrined in the Constitution. One of them is the right to an abortion, or I don't know, making the president not immune no matter what he does while he is in office.
I think that discussions about constitutional amendments are not just necessary, but long delayed. The fact of the matter is that we've been through a very lengthy period in our history in recent years of not amending the Constitution. And that's out of sync with the past. The history of this country saw many, many amendments at many critical stages, always done seriously, but with at least some acknowledgement that issues had arisen, needs for a change had occurred. You see that very evidently in something like lowering the voting age to 18 during the Vietnam War, where it was so clear we were sending young people off to fight and die in a war that they couldn't cast a vote with regard to, or in other ways influence the process. I think today it's very interesting that when we talk about these rulings, of course, the president is talking about birthright citizenship. Many, many people are looking at that ruling on campaign finance issues and saying that if ever there was a time for an amendment to overturn Citizens United and the Citizens United ruling from a number of years ago, and in general to put in some sort of campaign finance reform at the national level, this is the time. So yeah. I think we may open up a whole dialogue about constitutional amendments in short order.
I think it's an interesting way to get into this story because we, again, have not been talking about on the congressional level, really talking about amending the Constitution in a long time. And Lisa, when you look at what the court has been asked to do, especially recently, especially during this term, even during Donald Trump's last term, and you could say for Democratic presidents as well, I mean, they have been charged with updating the Constitution. They've been charged with updating the laws or reaffirming the laws in a way that the court itself was never supposed to be solely responsible for.
Yes, and
okay.
What I will say is that there is a big school of thought among legal scholars who believe that the Constitution is not fixed, that it's meant to evolve, that it is, as the inscription over my law school said, a living growth, not a changeless code. I looked at that infinite times when I entered the building, thinking to myself, that is sort of many people's philosophy of how the Constitution should be interpreted, that it is not fixed. And yet, in the Roberts Court, Katie, you have a bunch of people who fetishize history, who talk about history ad nauseum with respect to the proper interpretive method here. And maybe the issue isn't so much that the Constitution needs to change, but that the people interpreting the Constitution need to change, that their fixation with what words meant at the founding, what words meant when a particular amendment was passed, when a statute was passed, that maybe that's not the fairest way to interpret a document that was meant to survive and persevere.
That is where we are. And unless there is there's movement at the Supreme Court, there were rumors of that maybe happening today. They have been denied. But unless there's movement at the Supreme Court and a new slate of justices who have differing opinions, that's not going to happen.
Well, and look, there may be severe institutional impediments to amending the Constitution as well. But let me suggest another area in which many people in this country would say a constitutional amendment is warranted. The constitutional underpinnings for the right to abortion were always things that, from a legal scholarship perspective, people said, the way in which we justified, that it came from privacy and the way that we justified the Roe decision. There are many people who would identify themselves as stalwart feminists who would say Roe was wrongly decided and that we could have anticipated that we would end up in the moment we were in with Dobbs. If and when an FDA under Donald Trump forbids medication abortion from being prescribed in this country, I think you will see a groundswell of support for some form of constitutional amendment that either enshrines the right to reproductive freedom or sort of a recall of the need for an ERA, which many people thought about at the time that the Dobbs decision came down as well.
Brian, would that be a welcome change of pace for this court, or does this court want to be the one deciding what the Constitution is and what the Constitution should continue to be?
I think it'd be a very welcome change for this court. I mean, this is basically Justice Scalia's dream, is that the American people take the Constitution back as their document. Don't rely on the unelected judges to do it for us.
Even if he disagrees with where the American people go?
Yes, because you know what? Some of us believe in democracy wherever democracy may lead. And I think this is so refreshing to hear everybody saying, let's do something about this. Let's take this document back. And so I say open it up. You know, a lot of states are amending their constitutions on abortion right now, including red states. And so I think these are questions that we should be addressing as an American people, and we should not be waiting for judges to save us all the time.
What I say, John, about the anniversary of this country, the 250th anniversary, it's complicated, this history. I'm not going to deny that. But I do think that fighting for who we are and what we can be in this democracy is a fight worth having. And when we're talking about what should be in the Constitution or what needs to be changed, taken out, added in, it's a fight worth having.
Well, it's something else, too. It enlivens our democracy. It gets people engaged on fundamental issues. And those debates don't just occur in Congress. They go back down to the states. And people wrestle with it at the state level. They become a part of legislative contests, gubernatorial contests. And there's nothing wrong with that. Some years ago, more than a decade ago, I was in Scotland when they were voting on whether to declare independence from the United Kingdom. That wasn't a precise constitutional vote, but it was one that had huge meaning. People saw the consequences of what was going on. And I've rarely in my life been in a place where democracy was so dynamic. People were marching in the streets and putting up signs everywhere. Young people were actively engaged. There were debates for under 18-year-olds. And so I do think that at a time when there is so much disenchantment, so much frustration with the direction of the country and the way that the country operates, the notion that we might have real debates over constitutional amendments on issues like abortion rights and on issues like campaign finance reform is, in fact, refreshing. I think it does have a potential to give a real boost to our democracy. And frankly, as today showed us, we're not going to get solutions out of the courts.
Yeah. All right. Let's talk about the birthright decision itself out of this court. Brian, you predicted the other day that the Supreme Court would uphold it. They did. Were you surprised, though, that Gorsuch joined Alito and Thomas, number one? And number two, were you surprised that there was a split decision on, I'm gonna mangle this, but on the constitutional grounds here? Is that the right way to ask it?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. So we had, basically, we have a 5-4 decision on what the Constitution means, and then we have a 6-3 decision because Justice Kavanaugh said he could get to the same result as the majority through statutory interpretation, because there's a statute from Congress on who's a citizen. And I have to be frank, I'm not surprised that the constitutional vote was so close, because there has been a lot of historical research done in the last couple of years in anticipation of this case. And the history is kind of messy. You know, what it means for someone to be in the jurisdiction of the United States, subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, was a legal term of art. And we had to go back and take a look at it. And when we went back, it wasn't crystal clear. So I'm not surprised that people who take history seriously and are trying to do a good job reasonably disagreed on this.
What are your plans for the housing bill, Mr. President? Are you
I don't know. I think it's so unimportant by compared to the Save America Act. Here's what I would like to say. Much more than a bill, that big deal. It's a yawn. Some people say it's wonderful. To me, compared to the Save America Act, just about everything is a big yawn.
You and your pain about the cost of rent and the dream of buying a house are a, quote, big yawn to me. It is almost like Donald Trump is trying to suck at being president and winning the midterms. It is like he is trying to make ads for Democratic candidates' midterm campaigns. His apathy, his indifference, his lack of impulse control to say what he really thinks, which is obviously that the basic economic struggles of everyday Americans, including the millions who voted for him, are a, quote, yawn. It is why we are seeing his poll numbers plunge to levels that were simply unimaginable 2 years ago, particularly in deep red conservative parts of Texas. The state Trump won by 14 points. A brand new New York Times Siena poll shows Texas State Representative James Tallarico tied with that state's Republican candidate, the Attorney General Ken Paxton, at 47% apiece. The poll highlights how in Texas, just 44% of voters approve of the job Donald Trump is doing as president, with 53% of respondents in Texas saying they disapprove of Donald Trump. I want to bring into our conversation Democratic pollster, political analyst Cornell Belcher. Tim is still here. Cornell, where's your head these days on the state of the Democrats' fortunes in Texas?
Here we go with Texas again, Nicole? Here we go.
I know. I was a Beto believer. I have Texas. I have Texas. I feel like I spent a lot of time in Texas, and what the Texas Republicans like is not what Donald Trump is doing. Gold-gilded stuff does not sell with the sort of like the alpha conservative brand in Texas.
I think that's right, because look, I think it's the opening is that Trump's job approval is way underwater in Texas, which is a long time since you've seen a Republican president this far underwater in Texas. And look, to show you, and look, I was on your show back when the primary was just before the primary was happening, and I said, look, if Paxton takes out Cornyn, this becomes an open seat. And if Texas becomes an open seat, like all of us political hacks on this panel understand, that's different than an incumbent. And I think that becomes a much more competitive race, and Republicans are going to have to spend money there. And so what you have right now is a toss-up race. But for let's curb our enthusiasm for a moment here. It's a toss-up race where Paxton, who has been indicted, has allegations of cheating, has been impeached, and is an election denier, is in a toss-up race. It is a toss-up race where Paxton, who is seen by a majority as not having good ethics, and where Tallarico, by 18 or 13 points, seen as the more moral, upstanding person and the person with the right values, is in a toss-up in Texas. That's how tough Texas is. However, I think this time there is a shot, because you do see independents breaking for the Democrat there in a way where we've also seen, Nicole, in the special elections that we've seen, as well as the statewide elections in the off year we've seen independents breaking away from Republicans at such a staggering number that it puts a lot of these districts, a lot of these places in play. The other thing I would point out about the polling really quickly is that there was a lot of conversations about the ground that Republicans made and Donald Trump made among Hispanics, Latinos in the last presidential election. If you look at the way Tallarico is running up the score with Hispanics in Texas right now, you understand that that was not solid, or certainly not a shift that we've seen permanence to, as they are also moving back to Democrats.
Yeah, and we saw that in New Jersey. It was just a question of whether that was a New Jersey development or national trend. Cornel, let me ask you about the economy. Is it? I mean, because you made the point more clearly than I could have. I mean, on the question of ethics or morals, you've got Paxton's own wife answering those questions for us, that he is not moral, he is not ethical. If you take that away as perhaps not a top tier issue, is it the economy, or what is sort of the issue set look like for you?
Well, if you look at the data, we always want to make it about the economy because quite frankly, we're kind of lazy and it's an easy story. But it's never simply about the economy, right? Voters are making sense of their lives through the prism of their values, of their religiosity, through a lot of different things. But the economy is always central. And look, here's one where again you see independents really moving away from Donald Trump and Republicans on handling the economy. Nicole, if Donald Trump were not underwater by such a large percentage point in Texas, this would not be a tie race, right? Here is one where you absolutely see Donald Trump is the problem dragging down the Republican brand, because everywhere you see where Donald Trump is underwater, the vast majority of voters who are disapproving of Donald Trump are breaking for the Democrats. So the more he goes underwater, the better it is for Democrats. And here's a state where you see that fade. Like, this would not be that competitive of a race if Donald Trump was not such a drag on the ticket.
So, Tim, this is what the New York Times poll finds about this question of the economy. Jobs, the stock market, inflation, and the cost of living are by far the most pressing issue for Texas voters. 28% said economic issues would decide their vote, triple any other issue, and a full 60% of voters disapprove of Trump's handling of cost of living issues. It's sort of, again, I wasn't not a pollster, I'm not an expert, but from working on campaigns, those are just numbers that are becoming structural. And they actually kind of explain why for Trump policy meetings are a, quote, yawn. He needs his election rigging bill to pass because on the policies, he's given up.
Correct. Yes. And I think that there's maybe positive ways to look at that's, I think, going to be good for the Democrats. In elections, there's some negative ways to look at it, which is what's happening in his head if he doesn't care about elections anymore. But, on the Texas election, just kind of to add to what you and Cornel said, as part of my personal journey, I know that people like an update. After the trauma of 2024, Cornel had to get back to work doing pollstering. I quit looking at polls for a while because I just couldn't do it. It was too much PTSD, but I'm back, baby. I'm back. This poll came out this morning. I was digging into the crosstabs.
Me too.
I'm ready to get back out in the field. And I was looking at it, and look, I mean, it's interesting. The recall vote for the election in this poll was Trump plus 10. So, that's 1 in 10 Texas voters have moved, from voting, saying that they're no for Trump to saying that they'd vote for Tellerico, give or take. And so that's a meaningful difference. It's the Hispanic voters, almost, the majority of them, as Cornel pointed out. It's also some older whites, which I think we can probably shorthand as old George W. Bush types in Texas. And so those are the two groups that have flipped, where Tellerico is still getting just crushed, where Democrats have gotten crushed for a while now, is with working class white voters. And Tellerico is winning basically every other demographic except for working class white voters. He's losing by 40. And so that's the question, is how can the Democrats now over the next 4 months try to narrow that gap by talking about affordability, by demonstrating they care about affordability, by contrasting from Trump, who doesn't care about affordability, who only cares about the gold ballroom, and said that it was a yawn when people were concerned about housing. So some of those voters obviously aren't gettable, but I just think that is where the fight is. Is can you reach a breaking point with some percentage of working class whites in order to win in some of these red states? Because that's kind of the last holdout.